Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the conclusive chapter of our History of International Politics lectures. We will have a look today at the potential, the prospective future of the contemporary world order. What will it look like? And I would like to start with the speech held by Joe Biden last August 31. Remember the last point we saw very quickly. In our chapter 11, I emphasized the fact that Obama, despite his promises, did not put an end to the war on terror. He did not decide that America should withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. Joe Biden, however, took this decision, and he announced the end of America's longest war, 20 years, in a speech held on August 31. Please listen to Joe Biden's speech.
Last night in Kabul, the United States ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. We completed one of the biggest airlifts in history, with more than 120,000 people evacuated to safety. That number is more than double what most experts thought were possible. No nation has ever done anything like it in all of history. Only the United States had the capacity and the will and ability to do it, and we did it today, homeland. Remember why we went to Afghanistan in the first place? Because we were attacked by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda on September 11th, 2001. And they were based in Afghanistan. We delivered justice to bin Laden on May 2nd, 2011. Over a decade ago. Al-Qaeda was decimated. I respectfully suggest you ask yourself this question. If we'd been attacked on September 11, 2001, from Yemen instead of Afghanistan, would we have ever gone to war in Afghanistan? Even though the Taliban controlled Afghanistan in the year 2001? I believe the honest answer is no. That's because we had no vital interest in Afghanistan other than to prevent an attack on America's homeland and our friends. And that's true today. We succeeded in what we set out to do in Afghanistan over a decade ago. Then we stayed for another decade. It was time to end this war. This is a new world. The terror threat has metastasized across the world, well beyond Afghanistan. We face threats from al-Shabaab in Somalia, al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria and the Arabian Peninsula, and ISIS attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq and establishing affiliates across Africa and Asia. The fundamental obligation of a president, in my opinion, is to defend and protect America. Not against threats of 2001, but against the threats of 2021 and tomorrow. That is the guiding principle behind my decisions about Afghanistan. I simply do not believe that the safety and security of America is enhanced by continuing to deploy thousands of American troops and spending billions of dollars a year in Afghanistan. But I also know that the threat from terrorism continues in its pernicious and evil nature. But it's changed, expanded to other countries. Our strategy has to change too. We will maintain the fight against terrorism in Afghanistan and other countries. We just don't need to fight a ground war to do it. We have what's called over-the-horizon capabilities. which means we can strike terrorists and targets without American boots on the ground, or very few if needed. We've shown that capacity just in the last week. We struck ISIS-K remotely, days after they murdered 13 of our service members and dozens of innocent Afghans. And to ISIS-K, we are not done with you yet. As Commander-in-Chief, I firmly believe the best path to guard our safety and our security lies in a tough, unforgiving, targeted, precise strategy that goes after terror where it is today, not where it was 2 decades ago. That's what's in our national interest. And here's a critical thing to understand. The world is changing. We're engaged in a serious competition with China. We're dealing with the challenges on multiple fronts with Russia. We're confronted with cyber attacks and nuclear proliferation. We have to shore up America's competitiveness to meet these new challenges in the competition for the 21st century. And we can do both. Fight terrorism and take on new threats that are here now and will continue to be here in the future. And there's nothing China or Russia would rather have, would want more in this competition in the United States to be bogged down another decade in Afghanistan. As we turn the page on the foreign policy that has guided our nation the last 2 decades, we've got to learn from our mistakes. To me, there are 2 that are paramount. First, we must set missions with clear, achievable goals, not ones we'll never reach. And second, we must stay clearly focused on the fundamental national security interest of the United States of America. This decision about Afghanistan is not just about Afghanistan. It's about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. We saw a mission of counterterrorism in Afghanistan, getting the terrorists and stopping attacks, morph into a counterinsurgency, nation building, trying to create a democratic, cohesive, and united Afghanistan, something that has never been done over many centuries of Afghan's history. Moving on from that mindset and those kind of large-scale troop deployments will make us stronger and more effective and safer at home. And for anyone who gets the wrong idea, let me say clearly, to those who wish America harm, to those who engage in terrorism against us or our allies, know this: the United States will never rest. We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down to the ends of the earth, and you will pay the ultimate price. And let me be clear. We'll continue to support the Afghan people through diplomacy, international influence, and humanitarian aid. We'll continue to push for regional diplomacy engagement to prevent violence and instability. We'll continue to speak out for the basic rights of the Afghan people, especially women and girls, as we speak out for women and girls all around the globe. And I've been clear that human rights will be the center of our foreign policy. But the way to do that is not through endless military deployments, but through diplomacy, economic tools, and rallying the rest of the world for support. My fellow Americans, the war in Afghanistan is now over. I'm the 4th president who has faced the issue of whether and when to end this war. When I was running for president, I made a commitment to the American people that I would end this war. Today, I've honored that commitment. It was time to be honest with the American people again. We no longer had a clear purpose in an open-ended mission in Afghanistan. After 20 years of war in Afghanistan, I refuse to send another generation of America's sons and daughters to fight a war that should have ended long ago. After more than $2 trillion spent in Afghanistan, the cost that researchers at Brown University estimated would be over $300 million a day for 20 years in Afghanistan, for 2 decades. Yes, the American people should hear this. $300 million a day for 2 decades. If you take the number of 1 trillion, as many say, that's still $150 million a day for 2 decades. What have we lost as a consequence in terms of opportunities? I refuse to continue a war that was no longer in the service of the vital national interest of our people.
I consider, ladies and gentlemen, this speech to be a kind of turning point, synonymous with the end, if not necessarily, of the contemporary American-led world order, but at least synonymous with the end of the first stage of the contemporary post-Cold War order. Why? Because of 2 reasons. First of all, Joe Biden announces the end of America's presence in Afghanistan, and what's more, at the end of America's state-building practices. That is to say, he abandons America's liberal international strategy, aiming at establishing what John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt call a liberal hegemony, concretely consisting in exporting Western values and sometimes imposing them forcefully upon the international community's other, that is to say, the rogue states, the rogue actors. And the second reason is the following one. Joe Biden, when justifying this decision, appeals to America's national interests. What does America's national interest consist in? What does America's vital security interest consist in? It consists in containing China's rise. He also mentions Russia, but I will focus on China. It consists in containing China's rise, and in doing so, he implicitly acknowledges the end of America's material pre-eminence. That is to say, the end of the unipolar structure, or the prospective end of the unipolar structure of the post-Cold War world international system, which precisely permitted America to adopt its liberal hegemony strategy. To put it bluntly, Joe Biden's speech, I think, perfectly reflects the ongoing trends on the international scene, likely to give birth to a new world order, and I feel free to say he also corroborates the analysis that I proposed throughout my lectures of history of international politics. This speech, I think, is all the more so likely to be a turning point, since it is anything but a kind of personal caprice of Joe Biden. The speech rather is the crowning step of a process that had been started by his predecessors. Obama, after deciding a surge of American troops in 2009, when 30,000 soldiers were added to the already 68,000 American soldiers present in Afghanistan. After this surge, he outlined as early as in June 2011, that is to say, some weeks after bin Laden had been killed, he outlined a plan to withdraw these additional troops. And in 2014, he had announced that America should go on and should indeed withdraw more and more troops. In 2017, Donald Trump, who was favorable to a complete withdrawal, changed his mind temporarily, but accepted to negotiate with the Taliban. And it is the agreement signed between the Taliban and the Trump administration, an agreement signed in February 2020, which paved the way for a significant drawdown of US troops from Afghanistan. It included guarantees given by the Taliban that they would no longer accept terrorist networks on their soil. Not merely does Biden crown a process started 10 years ago by Obama, but one of America's major allies, France, and more specifically the president of France, Macron, decided a somehow similar policy in Mali when he announced some months ago that France would put an end to Operation Barkhane that followed the Operation Serval, which was launched in January 2013 by Hollande in order to try to get rid of the terrorist threat in Mali and beyond in the whole Sahel region. Here again, we have a reorganization of France's engagement, synonymous, however, with a fairly significant withdrawal of French troops in the region concerned. This decision of France can also be considered as having been taken on the basis of the same reasons as America's withdrawal, and therefore, once again, there is a kind of corroboration of my hypothesis of 2021 as being constitutive of a watershed, of a kind of turning point in the Western powers' post-Cold War world behavior. Anyway, let's try to have a look at the processes underway, and let's also try to anticipate what the future may consist in, what we may expect in the future. Despite, I'm aware of this kind of contradiction, the fact to propose an anticipation of the future, prediction of the future in a course dedicated to history. Well, I nevertheless will try to do so. So the decision, ladies and gentlemen, of Joe Biden to abandon state building or regime building or nation building or democracy building in Afghanistan and beyond Afghanistan is, I think, a logical consequence of the awareness that these state building operations are somehow doomed to failure. And I would like to quote John Mearsheimer, who perfectly sums up the basic reason of why state building operations are hardly successful in his latest book, The Great Delusion. Listen to John Mearsheimer. Turning a country into a democracy is extremely difficult. Why? Because foreign cultures have deep roots and are hard to manipulate. Nationalism, which is all about self-determination, nationalism, which is all about self-determination, leads countries to resist foreign interference in their domestic affairs. People who live in a nation state will want to shape their own politics without interference from an outside power. They do not want foreigners to tell them how to live, how to conduct their lives, despite the good or the noble intentions of these foreigners. And in most cases, the target state will fiercely resist the liberal crusaders, and their resistance may sometimes take the form of terrorism as in Afghanistan, or of guerrilla warfare, various types of insurrection, as had been the case in the past examples of state building imposed from the outside. Mearsheimer is aware, of course, that in Japan, in post-World War II Japan, and in post-World War II Germany, American interference and American state building operations and democracy building operations were successful. But he emphasizes, rightly so, I think, that in the cases of Japan and of Germany, there were some internal characteristics present, which precisely are absent in Afghanistan and beyond in the other states, the other failed states. We saw the concept last week, within which Western powers have been intervening since the end of the Cold War. These internal characteristics present in Germany and Japan are the following one: ethnic and religious homogeneity, a reasonably high level of economic prosperity, and some experience in the past with a democracy. Precisely these characteristics are absent in contemporary failed states. And the other example, which should not be confused with the contemporary state-building operations or democracy imposing operations of Western states, are the former Eastern European, Central European popular democracies who turned into democracies after the end of communism. Well, precisely, they chose to adopt a democratic regime. It was not imposed from the outside. What is beyond doubt, ladies and gentlemen, is that in Afghanistan, the state-building operation indeed did not work. This is what Biden himself says. The decision about Afghanistan is about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. We saw a mission of counter-terrorism in Afghanistan, getting the terrorists to stop the attacks, morph into a counter-insurgency, nation-building, trying to create a democratic, cohesive, and united Afghanistan. And he emphasizes something that this is something that has never been done over many centuries of Afghans' history. Joe Biden is absolutely right. He's absolutely right for the very simple reason that before America, the Soviet Union, if we accept to posit that they too were interested in a kind of state, a communist state-building operation in Afghanistan, anyway, the Soviets failed. And they needed only 10 years to come to the conclusion that the Red Army would never be successful. But what's more than 160 years ago, Friedrich Engels, in a short article, The Afghan War, where he reviewed a book by a British historian, commented on the incapacity of the then British imperial power to conquer and to stabilize the territory which nowadays corresponds to Afghanistan. This happened in the 1840s during the so-called Great Game, opposing the English Empire in India, the British Empire in India, to the Russian Tsarist Empire. They met in Central Asia, in today's Afghanistan. Have a look at Friedrich Engels' argumentation. The ideas he puts forward can almost word by word be applied to America, to the situation of America confronted to the Taliban. Just some quotes of his Afghan War, of his article, The Afghan War. The peculiar character of the people. The king's authority is personal and very uncertain, just as was the case for the Karzai, the first government that had been established by the American troops after Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001. It controlled at best 1/3 of the Afghan territory. The Afghans, I go on quoting, are brave, hardy, and independent race. They hate rule. They love individual independence. So this is the characteristic. These are the characteristics of the Afghan nation. He then alludes to the Russian British Great Game in Persia and Central Asia. A treaty was concluded by the British with the then ruling leader, the Shah, in Afghanistan. The British conquest, therefore, seemed accomplished. The troops were sent back, but the Afghans were not content to be ruled by the European infidels, by the European non-Muslims. So what did they do? Well, they launched one insurrection after another. The British commander gave orders, I quote, that constantly contradicted each other. I mentioned some minutes ago Obama's decision to increase very significantly the number of American troops present before deciding to withdraw them. So very similar contradictions. And negotiations began, just as Trump did in 2020 with the Taliban. So the British left Kabul, just as the Americans left Kabul. And the British attempt to set up a prince of their own making in Afghanistan ended, just as the American attempts to establish a somehow genuine state, and all the more so a democratic state, was doomed to failure. So Afghanistan's state-building operation was a failure, but Joe Biden agrees in saying that state operations are likely to fail beyond Afghanistan. Look at his quote, listen to his speech. We turn the page on the foreign policy that guided our nation the last 2 decades. We must learn from our mistakes. This decision about Afghanistan is not just about Afghanistan. It's about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. We will no longer try to remake or to rebuild or to democratize other countries. And in doing so, he comes to the conclusion which has been drawn by almost all the empirical researches that were undertaken, notably by American scholars, when looking at the end results of state-building operations or of military interventions aiming at imposing or establishing a democracy. 3 researches, I think, deserve to be mentioned. The first one, due to Andrew Unterline and Michael Craig, they examined 43 cases of imposed democratic regimes between 1800 and 1944, and they came to the conclusion that roughly 2/3, 2 out of 3 of these attempts failed. The second article, due to Jeffrey Pickering and Mark Passany, analyzed liberal interventions to promote democracy from 45 to 1996. Their conclusion is the following one: liberal intervention, I quote, has only rarely played a role in democratization. And the most negative conclusion is drawn by Bueno de Mesquita and George Downs in their article Intervention and Democracy. Between World War II and 2004, I quote the article, the US intervened more than 35 times in developing countries around the world. In only one case did a full-fledged stable democracy emerge within 10 years. In only one case out of 35, which is a percentage rate, success rate of 3%, in only one case, in Colombia, after America's decision to engage in a war on drugs in Colombia and South America. The only example of success. State-building operations are not successful. And this is then somehow the main reason why Joe Biden decided that America should abandon this policy. But he adds a second reason that we listened to, that we heard when listening to his speech, a very down-to-earth reason, the financial cost of America's presence in Afghanistan. More than $2 trillion spent in Afghanistan during 20 years, more than $2 trillion. That is to say, $300 million per day, during 20 years. A huge amount of money. I can add that after 12 years of America's presence in Afghanistan at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, the US had already spent more money to merely reconstruct Afghanistan or the Afghan army. I'm not talking of the cost of the American intervention itself or the American presence itself, the money given to the Afghan state to rebuild somehow efficient state machinery. In 2014, the amount was superior to the Marshall Plan that the Americans offered the whole Western European countries after World War II in order to permit a rapid, quick reconstruction of the Western Europeans' economies. This gives us an idea of the huge amount of money spent by the US. And this financial cost is significant, of course, in economic, in budgetary terms, in terms of the social consequences. of these expenditures, but it is also significant and illustrative in a purely geostrategic dimension. That is to say, it is illustrative of one of the two major causes, which, according to power cycle historians and power cycle theorists, notably Paul Kennedy, who applied it to World War I and to Great Britain's decline at the eve of World War I, to what these theorists or historians call the Imperial Overstretch or the Imperial Overexpansion. The argument is the following one. By definition, a stable international system, since it is ruled, managed by the prevailing power, profits the interests of the prevailing power. This prevailing power must therefore make sure that the existing order goes on prevailing in the future. That is to say, the stability on the long run of an international order depends on the capacity of the prevailing power to prevent any minor power to challenge this order, even in various regional environments likely to have an impact upon the smooth functioning of the system-wide structure, of the system-wide stability. Concretely, this means that the hegemonic power must dedicate a somehow significant part of its economic richness to military spending in order to be ready to intervene militarily in order to maintain regional stabilities where instability are likely to break out, where instabilities are likely to break out. Now, and here we come to what Kennedy calls imperial overstretch, these military interventions and their financial costs, of course, are unproductive from an economic point of view. That is to say, the military spending contributes to the slowdown of the economic growth rate of the hegemonic power. And this is all the more so important. This has all the more so a negative impact, since at the same time, the secondary powers who do not need to maintain the international order, well, these secondary powers can dedicate all their resources to go on improving their economic growth. And so gradually, the imperial overstretch contributes to the secondary power indirectly, to the secondary power coming close to the still hegemonic, but somehow relatively declining hegemonic power, economic resources. And this is exactly the argument of Joe Biden when he says, we are engaged in a serious competition with China, we're dealing with the challenges on multiple fronts with Russia, we have to shore up American competitiveness. We must make sure to remain competitive given China's rise. And he explicitly alludes to China or Russia profiting in the case of America going on spending uselessly spending money in Afghanistan. There's nothing China or Russia would rather have, would want more in this competition than the US to be bogged down another decade in Afghanistan. So Joe Biden refers directly to the power cycle theory, which therefore obviously is underpinning his analysis. The power cycle theory, ladies and gentlemen, also ascribes the change likely to occur in an international system structure. It ascribes it also to a purely economic factor, to a purely economic process, the so-called law of uneven growth. The argumentation is the following one, put forward by Kennedy as a historian, by Robert Gilpin. as an international relations theorist. By definition, ladies and gentlemen, the prevailing power, given that this preeminence is based on economic richness, was the first, chronologically speaking, to enter the economic growth cycle. Since it was the first, it will also be the first to see its economic growth rate slow down. It will go on growing economically, but at a slower pace. And this will happen in a moment of time when the secondary powers have an acceleration of their economic growth. That is to say, since they entered the growth cycle later, by definition, than the prevailing economy, they will be economically prospering, booming, while the still hegemonic, the prevalent economic power will slow down. Logically, then, sooner or later, the hegemonic power's resources will be matched by one or more than one of the rising power's economic capacities. That is to say, the system will no longer be characterized by unipolarity, which exists as long as there is a significant gap in material and first and foremost in economic resources, a gap favorable to the prevalent, to the preeminent power. The system will no longer be characterized by unipolarity, but it will enter a transition phase or a parity phase. A parity phase exists when the rising powers' economic resources reach at least 80% of the still prevailing hegemonic powers' GDP, gross domestic product. And according to the theory, we saw this in the last chapter of the first part, but I will sum it up once again. According to the power cycle theory, such a parity phase or such a transition phase, due to the prospective overtaking of the relatively declining power by the quickly rising secondary power, such a transitional parity phase is characterized by higher instability, by definition, since stability exists as long as there is a gap, by higher instability and by higher risks of war. At least this is the case when the secondary rising power is a dissatisfied state, a revisionist one. That is to say, a state eager to topple, to overthrow the still hegemonic power, to replace the existing order led by the still leading power by a new order which itself would manage. Peaceful transitions are possible, according to the theory, if the rising challenger shares more or less the same values. That is to say, basically, is politically organized on the basis of the same regime. This was the case when the US grew at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and did not challenge the then British prevailing order. However, the risk exists that precisely the rising power is a revisionist one. It was the case of Imperial Germany and also of Nazi Germany during the interwar period, eager to get rid of the then still prevailing Great Britain. If then the rising power is a challenge, and more specifically a contender, that is to say, a dissatisfied revisionist power, then the risks of an armed conflict opposing the relatively declining hegemon and the quickly rising contender, the risks of such a war are pretty high. For two main reasons. There is a risk of a preventive war launched by the still hegemonic power in order to stop the rise of the rising challenger before it is too late. And according to Gilpin, this is what happened when Sparta declared war to Athens, because Athens' growth was perceived by Sparta as a danger to its still existing preeminence. But the war can also occur indirectly, that is to say, because of the rising power's behavior in its region, such an aggressive behavior, such an ambitious strategy in the neighborhood of the rising challenger would compel the still hegemonic power to intervene in order precisely to maintain regional stability and in order to prevent the rising challenger from becoming too powerful in its own region, to become what John Mearsheimer calls a regional hegemon. And in this case, a local conflict would likely to escalate into a major conflict. This, according to Robert Gilpin, occurred in World War I when Imperial Germany, at the eve of World War I, and Imperial Germany supported Austria in its war against Serbia. A success, a victory of Germany would have meant a more powerful Germany on the continent, synonymous with an imbalance on the continent favorable to Germany, and therefore the end of Great Britain's prevalence on the worldwide scale. Such a major conflict, the last point in the theory, is considered to be a hegemonic conflict by Robert Gilpin, that is to say, a hegemonic war rather than a conflict, a hegemonic war in the meaning of a war giving birth to a new system, to a new order, to a new international society, therefore too, managed, ruled by a new prevailing power. So the question I feel free to ask in my attempt to try to imagine what we may expect for the future, the question then we might ask, or I feel free to ask, is the following one: are we nowadays living in a similar period of transitional parity because of China's rise and because of America's relative decline? Because of China's rise, not because of Russia's new assertiveness, which is emphasized by Biden in his speech. I do not consider that the challenges launched by Russia are likely to threaten America's preeminence. China's rise, however, is. So is China likely to match America's resources in a more or less near future? Is China the next major power, or at least America's next challenger, and maybe should I say contender? Well, what can we respond to this question? The first point is that the Americans themselves do consider China as their future competitor, their future peer competitor. This is the term proposed by American administrations. I think it was the Rand Corporation was the first to use this term. The Americans themselves consider China to be their future peer competitor. And this is the case for 2.5 decades now. Remember what we saw in the last chapter of the first part, when we had a look at the various predictions, the various scenarios that were proposed, notably by realist scholars. They more or less bet on the return of a multipolar system, either directly or indirectly. Directly, this was the case of Kissinger, and also of Kenneth Walsh to some extent, and even of Mearsheimer. Or indirectly, that is to say, Krauthammer expected unipolarity to prevail, but only during a short period. Sooner or later, multipolarity would come back, and they all agreed in saying that roughly the 21st century would be characterized by a competition between the US, Russia, China, Japan, India, and maybe even Europe in the case of a unified Europe. These predictions, however, were dropped very quickly. The Americans changed their mind at the latest during the second half of the 1990s for two reasons. First, they could not but agree in saying that unipolarity, indeed, rather than multipolarity, characterized the international system. And regarding the future potential arrivals of the US, not 3 or 4 or 5 were acknowledged to be serious. Only one ended up being the sole potential peer competitor, and this power, of course, is China. For instance, in 1997, the Pentagon's quadrennial review, I quote it, emphasized that in the period beyond 2015, this was the expectation in 1997, so 18 years before the period concerned, in the period beyond 2015, there is the possibility that a regional power or a global peer competitor may emerge, namely China, because of its, I quote, potential to become a major military power in Asia. So under Clinton's administration, China was perceived as the future peer competitor. The same is true for the Bush administration, at least after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and America's operation during Iraqi freedom against Saddam Hussein. The quadrennial defense review of the Pentagon in 2006 explicitly mentioned China to be America's main adversary. Listen to this: of the major and emerging powers, China has the greatest potential to compete militarily with the US and field disruptive military technologies that could over time offset traditional American advantages in the absence of US counter strategies. So America should prevent China from becoming too powerful economically. In 2009, Obama went as far as recognizing that China will be the future partner of the US in managing the world. This is what he said. The relationship, in a speech held in 2009, that is to say immediately after arriving at the White House, the relationship between the US and China will shape the 21st century. If it is the relationship with the US and China, this means that America alone is no longer able to do what it wants to do. Donald Trump, that launched his trade war against China, which implicitly amounts to designating China as America's major rival beyond the mere economic or commercial dimension. And 1 or 2 weeks ago, Joe Biden organized his virtual summit with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, which once again amounts to implicitly recognizing China as America's equal partner. So the American administrations, the American pundits and experts agree in considering China as a future rival or partner. And the same is true, of course, for American academics. I just would like to mention two predictions that were made very exactly 20 years ago in 2001. The first one is due to Ronald Taman, a disciple of Organsky, who together with Gilpin is at the origin of the power cycle theory. Ronald Taman and other researchers of the same approach published in 2001 the book Power Transitions, Strategies for the 21st Century. And this is what they wrote. The key question is not whether China will be the dominant nation, but when it will become the dominant nation. And the same is true for John Mearsheimer in his Tragedy of Great Power Politics. The first edition also was published in 2001. It was updated meanwhile. Anyway, as early as in 2001, this is what Mearsheimer wrote: a wealthy China, a future wealthy China, will not be a status quo power. It will be an aggressive state, determined to achieve regional hegemony in East Asia, in the Pacific, in the East Asian and Pacific region. So, to some extent, then, the hypothesis of China being the future rival of the US is a common sense statement in America. And to say the least, the empirical data do, of course, corroborate this perception. So let's have a look at the concrete power of China when compared to the US. The power cycle theory, by definition, looks at the comparative power resources of the still prevailing and the rapidly rising power. And let's also take into account the two dimensions of power that we saw in our first part, that is to say, power defined in terms of resources, the classical definition of power, and power defined in terms of influence, the more recent or academic conception in social sciences of power. In terms of resources, ladies and gentlemen, what do empirical figures tell us? Well, they tell us that China is richer than the US if we compare their gross domestic products in terms of purchasing power parity. Just look at 2021 estimates of the IMF, 22 trillions for the US, 26 for China. And China surpassed America's GDP in terms of purchasing power parity 7 years ago in 2014 for the first time. The gap widened. Ever since then, things are different. Things are somehow different, slightly, but also significantly different if we compare the two GDPs at a nominal rate, that is to say, at the official exchange rate of the Chinese currency in American dollars. What do we see? We see that in 2021, the Chinese GDP reached the equivalent of 73.4% of America's GDP, so a bit less than 3/4 of America's richness. However, even if we privilege this comparison, this kind of comparison, and this is the case indeed of the analysis proposed within the power cycle, within the researches using the power cycle theory, because those researches go back to the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, and there were no measurements in terms of power, of purchasing power parity. If then we stick to the nominal rate when comparing the US GDP to the Chinese GDP, what do we see? We see that obviously the long-term tendency is very favorable to China. During the two decades and a half, the two last decades and a half now, for the two decades and a half now, China gradually, China's growth gradually permits it to come very close to America's richness. It only represented less than 7% 30 years ago. It nowadays represents almost 3/4. If from the economic material resources we go to the military strength of the US and China, the situation is different. The situation is different because America's military preeminence is obvious. Just look at the military budgets of 2020, according to the data provided by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The military budget of the US amounted to $778 billion, to be compared to the $252 billion of China. So China's military budget last year amounted to less than 1/3 of America's military spending. And what's more, if we look at the chronological evolution over time of China's military spending, what do we see? We see that never did China dedicate more than 2% of its economic richness to military expenditures. That is to say, China does not dedicate a significant part of its richness to military spending. In absolute terms, there is, of course, a significant increase of Chinese military budget. But relatively to what it could dedicate to military spending, given its very quick economic rise, relatively speaking, China has no or not yet significant military ambitions. At first sight, ladies and gentlemen, this should or might be good news for the US. Actually, and according to the power cycle theory, this is not true. Chinese behavior is anything but good news. Why? Because according to the power cycle theory, it is normal for an emerging power first to consolidate its economy before 1 or 2 generations later having political, strategic, military ambitions, and therefore likely to adopt a more expansionist policy. And this is precisely what the Soviet Union, and maybe should I say the Russian, Tsarist Russia, did not do. And this explains why the Soviet Union, but also the Russian, Tsarist Russia in 1914 collapsed very quickly, because they had committed the mistake to dedicate too important a part of their poor economic basis to military spending. I already mentioned the concept of the poor power that Russia and the Soviet Union were in the past. China precisely does not commit this mistake. It first consolidates its economy, and we can expect it to start seriously its developing its military capabilities once it will have definitely consolidated its economic basis. And there are already some indicators of China being military ambitious. Just look at the new maritime and the new spatial programs of China. Western experts consider that within 25 or 30 years or so, that is in 2040s, at the latest in 2050, China's military spending should match America's military spending. So to sum up this point, China will probably match America's economic resources within 10 years, at the latest in 2030, probably earlier. It may match America's military spending within 30 years or so. And on the basis of these statements, when looking at the mere power resources, there is no doubt that the contemporary unipolar system structure is gradually entering a transition period or a parity phase. And this then explains why many authors, and first and foremost Graham Allison in his Destined for War, expect a future war between China and the US. So-called Thucydides' trap, to use the expression of Graham Allison, an allusion to Thucydides, who explained the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War by the growth of Athens and the fear, the alarm that it created in the mind of the leaders of Sparta and compelled them to go to war. So if this scenario should repeat itself, the rise of China and the fear that this rise inspired to American leaders might push American leaders to go to war to prevent China from becoming too powerful. Not everybody, however, of course, agrees with Allison's alarmist analysis, an alarmist analysis which is also somehow based on a mechanic model, which gives no possibility for politicians or agents to act. Anyway, some others, should I say, academics, when looking at China, not merely look at power in terms of resources, at China's power in terms of resources, but they look at China's power in terms of influence. That is to say, is China likely to shape other states than the US, of course, other states' behavior? Is China able to incite or to seduce these states in order to make them do what it wants them to do, notably accept a prospective Chinese leadership, or at least is it able to convince them to no longer consider America's preeminence to be automatic, to be legitimate. This Chinese power in terms of influence is notably analyzed by David Shambaugh in his China Goes Global, where he considers China to be a partial power and not a global power. And in a book edited by Aslan Toya, he contributes an article, and in this article, in the book called Will China Always Be Peaceful, he goes as far as considering China as the probable paper tiger of the 21st century. The expression paper tiger, ladies and gentlemen, had been used during the Cold War by Mao, the then Chinese leader. When talking of the US, he said the US, when talking with the Soviets, with Khrushchev, he said that the US was a mere paper tiger. And this is what I learned when I was a student. And the Soviet leader Khrushchev replied to Mao, yes, it may be a paper tiger, but it has atomic teeth. So we should nevertheless beware of America's military strength. Anyway, China, Shambaugh's analysis is the following one. China is merely a partial power. Why? First, because if we look at the military influence of China, it has no ally. China has absolutely no ally. It is a lonely power. If we look back at the Cold War, the USSR had some allies, at least during the 21st years of the Cold War. China was its major ally. Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany had allies. China has no ally. It is a lonely power, so it is unable, at least in the near future, to project easily its military forces, even if these forces should become significant, beyond the East Asian region. Regarding the diplomatic power now, according to David Shambaugh, China's diplomatic power is more, I quote, symbolism than substance. It's more symbolism than substance. Why? Because China indeed enjoys a great power status. It is permanent member of the UN Security Council. It is member of the G20, of the G2. It participates in all international summits. But during these conferences, Chinese leaders are more reactive than active. They are risk averse. They have narrowly defined national interests. That is to say, they take no initiatives regarding the global governance. They are assertive when it comes to maintaining the control of East Asia, of the China Sea in the Pacific. But beyond this region, China's behavior offers a mixed picture. Somehow it contributes to proposed policies in order to manage global commons, climate change, etc., public health, but it does not commit itself in conflict-ridden regions, notably the Middle East or the Near East. Third point emphasized by David Shambaugh, if we look at China's soft power, here in the common sense of soft power, that is to say, the capacity of China to seduce thanks to non-material resources. Strictly speaking, ladies and gentlemen, China has no and can have no soft power, because soft power in the strict meaning of Joseph Nye emanates from the civil society, is not controlled and is not consciously put into practice by a government. So if we look at the seduction that China could exert, it almost is inexistent. No society beyond China is eager to import what could be a Chinese way of life. No country is eager to copy the Chinese political system, which is a mixture of Leninist communism, of Asian authoritarianism, and of Confucian traditionalism. the Chinese economic system, very successful, cannot be replicated elsewhere because it is a product of unique Chinese features, huge economies of scale, of course, Soviet style planning, individual entrepreneurship, but controlled by the Communist Party, as proven very recently by the willingness of said Communist Party to control the big tech, Alibaba, Tencent, etc., etc. And last but not least, according to Shambo, China's economy still has some characteristic of third world countries or of developing countries. Its GDP regarding its GDP per capita, China is ranked 79th in nominal terms and only 100th in purchasing power parity terms. And regarding the Human Development Index, it is ranked 85th. So all in all, according to David Shambo, China, I quote, remains very long from becoming a global power on par with the US. So David Shambo does not expect a somehow significant conflict to break out opposing China to the US in a more or less near future. However, a clash could occur. If such a clash should occur, it would be the indirect consequence of both powers being dragged into a military confrontation because of the issues at stake in East Asia and in the Pacific region. That is to say, a kind of military accident or a dispute over Taiwan or a dispute of different territorial claims, the islands that are claimed by China, by Taiwan, by the Philippines, by Vietnam, by Japan, or at last the freedom of navigation, given the importance of the sea lanes in East Asia, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Pacific Ocean. If then we should sum up Shambo's analysis, we can come to the following deduction. China is not assertive on the global scale, on the worldwide international scale. It somehow wants to be recognized as a peer partner, a peer leader, much more than a contending competitor, eager to challenge America's order. However, on the other hand, it obviously is intractable, uncompromising on the regional scene of East Asia and of the western shore of the Pacific Ocean. Let's then compare contemporary China to Imperial Germany at the eve of World War I. Since the rise of Imperial Germany, according to the power cycle theory, triggered the outbreak of World War I as the consequence of the parity phase between the rising Germany and the relatively declining Great Britain. If we compare the two situations, there is a common point and there is a difference. The difference is that China remains satisfied on the global scale. I just mentioned this 1 minute ago. It accepts the existing order, which it is profiting from in economic terms, while this was not the case for Germany. Germany had worldwide ambitions, wanted to get rid of the British leadership, and this is the reason why it launched its naval arms race, and it also wanted it's part of the colonial cake, which was first and foremost shared among the British and the French. The common point is that just as China focuses on its region, Germany started its challenge of the then British order also in its region, that is to say, in the so-called German hinterland, that is to say, Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe, when it decided to join Austria in Austria's war against Serbia after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. So the overall picture is obviously ambiguous. And in the US, among academics and also among experts, the debate is going on. What the future will bring us regarding the prospective competition between the US and China. On the one hand, we have scholars such as Alistair Johnston, who bets on China behaving moderately in the future. He does not consider China's new assertiveness to be that new. He also influenced Bill Clinton's engagement strategy in the 1990s when China was invited to join the different international organizations in order to try to transform it into a satisfied power. On the other hand, we have hardcore realist scholars such as Sebastian Rosato, who claims that America should be prudent when dealing with China because of what he calls the inscrutable intentions of great powers. Even if China claims that it accepts the international order, we do not know, we cannot know what its future intentions might be. My personal analysis, if I may, ladies and gentlemen, will consist in establishing a comparison between China's rise, not with Germany's rise, but with America's rise at the eve of World War I, that is to say, during the last decades of the 19th century, during the first decade of the 20th century. We saw this point in our first part and also in our second part. Until 1919, ladies and gentlemen, or 1917, when Wilson decided that America should enter World War I, maybe even until Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese attacked the US and the US was dragging to World War II. Up to this period, the US, despite being the world's first economic power, practiced imperial overstretch. It had no worldwide political strategic ambitions. It privileged a commercial, economic foreign policy within the then British-led order, which it acknowledged to be legitimate, and the British did not consider the US to be a contender, a challenger to said order. But it claimed its domination on the Western Hemisphere, from Canada to Argentina, in a somehow defensive stance, as long as the Monroe Doctrine prevailed, but very offensively once the Roosevelt corollary was adopted at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And I cannot help, ladies and gentlemen, from drawing a kind of quasi-perfect parallel with China's situation nowadays. China, too, says that its economic foreign investments are only driven by the aim of economic welfare for China, for the Chinese population, but also for the rest of the world. Which I'm also saying that it accepts the order. It is not eager to overthrow America's order, just as America accepted 120 years ago the British order. And China, just as America was eager to control the Western Hemisphere, China too claims that it is eager to, and it has the right to control East Asia and the western part of the Pacific Ocean. If we add to this, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that China does not share the same values as the US, while the US shared the same values as Great Britain 120, 130 years ago, if we can deduce from this fact that due to this significant difference, China is perceived as different and therefore as potentially hostile by the US, then we cannot but come to the conclusion that the stage is set for the US-Chinese rivalry to break out sooner or later. And this is the analysis also put forward by John Mearsheimer in many publications, and for instance, in a short article called entitled China's Unpeaceful Rise. The main arguments are the following ones. China is likely, I quote, to try to dominate Asia the way the US dominates the Western Hemisphere. We should expect China to come up with its own version of the Monroe Doctrine. Beijing should want a militarily weak Japan and Russia, just as the US wants Canada and Mexico to be militarily weak. What's more, I go on quoting, why should a powerful China accept American military forces in its backyard? To put it differently, Mearsheimer expects China to try to get rid of America's presence in East Asia and the Western Pacific Ocean. China, I quote, is likely to imitate the US, to imitate what the US did 120 years ago, and attempt to become a regional hegemon in East Asia, just as America became a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere before becoming a world hegemon, though Mearsheimer does not accept the possibility of a world hegemon because of his balance of power theory. So if China is likely to imitate the US to become the only power in East Asia, then the US will be confronted with the following question: should I accept to go or should I try to stay? And the answer, according to Mearsheimer, is obvious. We know what the American policy will consist in. The historical record shows us how American policymakers will react if China attempts to dominate Asia. The US will not accept, and thus there will be a competition. I sum up, or I conclude the quote of Mearsheimer with the following sentences. I, Mearsheimer, have painted a picture of what is likely to happen if China continues to rise. Of course, all this scenario, the whole scenario, presupposes that the Chinese economic growth will go up. This picture is not a pretty one, but international politics is a dangerous and a nasty business. And this is what Mearsheimer calls the tragedy of great power politics. The tragedy of great power politics. Conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, a conflict between China and the US is probable. Will this conflict be an armed conflict? Remember the difference between a conflict and an armed conflict. That is to say, is there a risk of a war breaking out? A war is not impossible. Despite the two arguments that are pretty often put forward by optimists. The first argument is the liberal argument of economic interdependence. The second argument is the strategic argument of the nuclear revolution. Let's have a very quick look at these two arguments, claiming that a war would be improbable. The first argument, the liberal economic interdependence argument, goes back to Montesquieu, claiming that two states that have commercial intercourse would be foolish, irrational, to go to war against each other. Such a war would be counterproductive because it would put an end to trade, which profits the two populations. Realists, however, do not consider economic interdependence to be to be such a peace-prone factor, because they consider that economic interdependence may also, and actually first and foremost, according to them, be synonymous with vulnerability. Or the more so, one country is likely to be more dependent than the other one, which means that the interdependence is never perfectly equal. This debate also refers to empirical indicators favorable either to the liberals or to the realists. Liberals take as example the 19th century, synonymous with the rise of trade and the rise of capitalist economy, industrialization, and the 19th century was a fairly peaceful or stable one among major European powers. And the liberals also emphasized the fact that World War I broke out after this liberal trade regime was abandoned, given that the European powers adopted protectionist policies. So somehow the liberals are proven right by at least this historical period. But the realists emphasize precisely the fact that at the eve of World War I, the European powers did not hesitate to adopt protectionist policies. That is to say, they were not that convinced by the idea that economic interdependence profits all the states. To put differently, realists emphasize the fact that despite the prospective gains of economic interdependence, states privilege their political ambitions, political passions triumph over economic rationality. And this debate then, to some extent, ended up in Robert Gilpin coming to the conclusion, I quote The Political Economy of International Relations, no generalizations on the relationship of economic interdependence and political behavior appear to be possible. We cannot give a definitive argument favorable either to the liberals or to the realists. Sometimes economic intercourse can moderate political relations. Sometimes it does aggravate them. Is there a way out of this kind of dead end? Yes, according to Dale Copeland in his Economic Interdependence and War. According to Dale Copeland, it is not the absolute amount of trade which is important. What is important is what he calls the trade expectations. That is to say, what states anticipate regarding their commercial interactions with a partner which or not may become a rival. That is to say, if a state expects its trade to go on, it would indeed be foolish for said states to interrupt it by going to war. But if a state, for various reasons, does not think that it will go on profiting from its trade with other states, then the option war will once again, to some extent, become credible, become rational. And ladies and gentlemen, if we think of what Trump did when he launched his trade war, and if we think of what China drew as a conclusion from Trump's behavior, we should be prudent when saying that economic interdependence is a force for peace. It may be a force for peace, but in the case of protectionist policies being adopted in the future, either by the Americans or by the Chinese, this economic interdependence will no longer have such a positive impact upon the political rivalry. And this political rivalry, ladies and gentlemen, is likely to end up to result in a war despite the nuclear revolution. This is the second argument according to which the nuclear revolution, by introducing the perspective of the suicide and the death of mankind, should incite all states possessing nuclear weapons to behave prudently, not to go to war because of the risk of an escalation synonymous with the suicide of both powers and even of the whole humanity. Well, once again, I would be a bit more skeptical. I would share here the idea of Karl Leiber in his War and the Engineers. Nuclear weapons may indeed prevent nuclear wars, but it is far from being certain that they do prevent infranuclear or non-nuclear or conventional wars. That is to say, if a state knows that its adversary will not dare to resort to nuclear weapons because of the suicide of mankind, etc., and if the second state knows that the first state knows that the second state will not resort to nuclear weapons, then both can come to the conclusion nobody will escalate to nuclear weapons. We therefore both can launch a non-nuclear war without risking a nuclear confrontation, which would mean then that the nuclear technology would have no more political impact. And this is the conclusion of Karl Leiber. Engineers do not dominate politicians. Politicians dominate engineers. They use technologies in order to fit their policies. If then we apply this argumentation to our case study, then a war, at least a non-nuclear war opposing China to the US, is conceivable, is not completely improbable. The only means to avoid it, to prevent it, then what Barry Buzan calls the security complex factor. According to Barry Buzan, he used this concept in another context. The book was written, first edition of the book was written in the 1980s during the Cold War. According to Barry Buzan, states feel unsafe in an anarchical environment because they cannot know another state's intentions. So they feel insecure. This security, however, the intensity of this insecurity feeling, however, depends on where the threat is coming from. That is to say, all things being equal, a state feels more threatened by a geographical contiguous state, while a state which is geographically distant, which has no common borders, is somehow, by definition, not perceived to be that threatening because of the distance. If we apply this to our case study, then the rise of China and all the more so prospective expansionist ambitions of China in the 2040s and in the 2050s, these ambitions will be felt, will be perceived to be threatening first and foremost by Chinese neighbors, from Japan to Australia, from India to Indonesia to Vietnam to the Philippines. Logically then, if this geographical factor indeed is a significant variable, these powers, these regional states should appeal to the US for their protection. And this is to say, they would join alliances led by the still hegemonic America. And the evolution of the last years or so corroborates this analysis. America established a so-called quadrilateral security dialogue, including the US, Japan, India, and Australia. And they undertook common naval exercises last year. And 2 months ago, in September, what did the US do? It established a new alliance, AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, the US, once again, in order to contain China's rise. So we can expect the US to adopt a containment strategy fairly similar to the one that permitted the US to contain what it perceived as the Soviet threat throughout the Cold War. And given the huge alliances established by the US, China should come to the conclusion that it cannot afford to challenge the US militarily speaking. China should come to this conclusion if, of course, their leaders are rational. If we posit the rationality of leaders, their willingness to resort to diplomacy rather than to violence, then we can hope that the forthcoming Chinese-American rivalry will not result in a violent confrontation. The future will tell us, ladies and gentlemen, what and how far this prediction is valid or not. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending today's lecture and all my lectures. I wish you all the best. Goodbye.